somebody scanning their dinner. I hear salmon. I hear broccolini. So welcome to Highlighter Live. We've been building Highlighter as a place on the web to gather and read books together. And starting today with Highlighter Live, we're bringing authors into the mix. I want to explain a little bit about how the format works. Some Highlighter members have been asking questions ahead of tonight's show on the High Growth Handbook page on Highlighter. And we're also accepting questions and topics directly in the chat. We've set up the event to be highly interactive, so we're going to be inviting people up on stage to join the discussion and ask questions directly. So for intro, we're delighted to kick off the series with Elad Gil. Now, Elad is so well known in angel investing and startup circles that he has actually earned the one name moniker, much like Beyonce, Oprah, Kanye, or Prince have in the entertainment industry. If you say Elad, everyone knows exactly who you mean. He's an angel investor in startups like Stripe, Airbnb, Notion, Airtable, and more, and he's the founder and chairman of Color Genomics. So Elad, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
You and I first met when we were, I think, 20-somethings at Google back in the mid-aughts. And I've watched you begin your journey as a public writer on Twitter and on your own blog. Now, my understanding is that the online writing is the primary genesis of the book we're here to talk about tonight, the High Growth Handbook. And I'm curious to hear more about this journey. So what were your goals when you started writing online? And did you imagine that it could turn into something like a book someday?
Yeah, so the goals initially are pretty simple. I think I set up a couple joke websites. Like I remember doing Incubator, which was a accelerator for accelerators. So could you create your own Y Combinator? And I remember doing a bunch of sort of stupid tech jokey things. And then
I remember Airtensile was the Airbnb for utensils.
Exactly. Yeah, that's
make use of your spare utensil inventory.
Yeah, it was very unfortunate. So that was one side of it, but most of my time was actually spent basically writing up as blog posts questions that friends of mine who were starting companies at the same time I was kept asking, or questions that I myself was facing and that I thought other people would benefit from. So the first set of blogs that I wrote were very much just, almost like FAQs for early stage startups. And then as my first company got acquired by Twitter, and then I helped take that company from 90 to 1,500 people over 2.5 years, as well as I got involved with a lot of companies that were breaking out themselves. I started writing up more and more stuff that was a bit more late stage. How do you buy other companies, or somebody's trying to buy you, what should you do? Or, how do you hire for roles that you've never dealt with? And eventually I was getting so many common sort of late stage questions that I decided to just write it up and post it as a website. And a few days before I was going to post it, I was talking with John Collison, one of the founders of Stripe, and he asked to see it. I sent him a link, and then a day or two later, he pinged me and just asked if Stripe could publish it. And so it was very organic. It wasn't meant to be a book initially. I never went out and got an agent and all that kind of stuff. So it was a very organic thing. And one thing that really surprised me is once you actually had a physical book, people started treating your writing very differently. Like it suddenly had a level of seriousness that if it was just a website, people wouldn't have treated quite the same. And I think the most extreme example of that is every time my mom would visit, she would leave a check for me, like, $50 or something, like hidden in my mail. So I'd find it after she left, and it was her way of supporting me, because she thought that I was kind of struggling out here or something. I'm not sure why she could. And when the book came out, that was the first time that she didn't leave me money after that moment. And so she's like, okay, you're going to be fine in Silicon Valley. So
that's probably an inspiring story for a lot of creators today, because there's a lot of people starting out creating online, and it always seems that like the most organic approaches to things work, where you just do something out of passion or love, or it makes sense, or it fits into the world, instead of kind of trying to shape it too much to sort of a purpose, right? You can kind of discover the purpose over time.
I think also repetition or consistency matters a lot too, because you suddenly end up with a body of work that kind of builds without even realizing that body of work is building. So the other piece to me is, it's sort of the Fred Wilson at USV blogging, where, once every end post he has something really good, and it takes those end posts, but he's sort of built up this corpus of interest.
I've heard people talk about how a lot of times when you're writing, you want to spend your time giving, and you sort of want to only rarely sort of make an ask or or sort of, in a sense, do something that's a little bit more personal? Do you feel like there's a natural ebb and flow or give and take that you're sort of conscious of, or does it kind of happen just as it is?
It kind of depends on what it is. I think in the context of the High Growth Handbook, initially I just sat down and I wrote, probably 100, 150 pages over 2 weeks. I just sat down and banged it out. And, I had a really long outline for it. And I only ended up writing, I think, a third or half of the content that I was planning to write, because there was so much that I'd been through, as well as that I'd seen other companies go through, that it just made sense to sort of bang it out. And then as I was started interviewing different people for the book, additional insights or things came out of those conversations. And so, I think from that perspective, there was some interesting give or take where I was like, oh yeah, that's a really great thing that I forgot to mention. Or in some cases, oh, I never even thought of that. Like I love the Claire Hughes Johnson conversation around, writing a guide to herself or a user manual to a person. I thought was a great insight that I never, would have heard of otherwise. So there were definitely tidbits that I picked up and then tried to amplify in the book itself.
That makes sense. That particular tidbit, I think I had tweeted about when I first read the book, a couple of years ago. And I think that was like one of the things that I got so many DMs. People are like, okay, what's the guide to you? And, I want to see it. And what's the guide to working with other people? And how should we think about that? Because I think it's a powerful idea that, we don't see, they're kind of like locked up inside these companies. And unless you sort of have access or visibility into that, it's hard to get a full sense of that.
Yeah. It's almost like, you see all these startups leave companies to build effectively internal tools that the company had that they then resell to everybody else. PagerDuty might be a good example of that. Or other sort of products that everybody was building and then somebody just went and commercialized it. And there's no version of that for ideas or best practices that startups or companies come up with. And so often you need to wait for that person that was at that startup at a seminal moment to go and become an executive somewhere and then bring a process or bring an idea or bring an approach with them. And so to your point, I think there's this really interesting corpus of knowledge that's just locked up in people. And the question is, how can you really surface or free that?
Right. I wonder if some of that comes, actually, I was going to ask you about part of the process on the book, because there's, each of the chapters kind of has a person that's a focus, and it's kind of a give and take, back and forth interview. Did you set up an hour to chat with people and just throw a tape recorder down and just capture all their thoughts, or an iPhone or something?
Yeah, I basically tried to come up with who would be a good fit for certain sections. And then I would send them the list of questions in advance. And then, because I wanted to have them think about it, so the content would actually be good. And then I also wanted to be time efficient and crisp. And so I think almost every interview is more or less verbatim, with some sections moved around a little bit versus heavily edited. And, you're trying to down because it's a messy conversation or something. And so I was lucky in that the people that I spoke with, I tried to target sort of the world experts in a given area, but also, a lot of it I think was prepped so that the conversation could be very focused and efficient and, come back to the topics that, were relevant for IPOs or relevant for M&A or relevant for board management or whatever it may be.
This was published in 2018, I think, right? And so a couple of years have gone by. There've been a lot of changes in the world in the past year since publication. So, and dynamics that directly impact the startup ecosystem around like mega funds, like SoftBank, and other dynamics at play with rise of remote work. So, are there any things that sort of, as you've, has there been any points that you'd update or kind of any thinking that's evolved since then?
Yeah, I think there's an enormous amount to update across, all the issues that you mentioned. I think fundamentally there are some things that are reasonably universal for startups, and those haven't changed. In the 90s, the founders would often not be the CEO of the company, right? They would hire in what they call a gray-haired CEO, and the founder would take a VP product role or would take a marketing role. And even with Larry and Sergey at Google, which was seeing enormous growth, they brought in Eric Schmidt to run the company. And then in 2004, when Facebook got going, one of the really big shifts there was, as far as I understand it, Sean Parker got fired from Plaxo and joined Facebook. So Sean joined Facebook, and according to the lore, he convinced Zuck to really maintain board control and create a situation where he could remain CEO. And then they ended up hiring Sheryl Sandberg as COO versus CEO. And that was a really big shift I felt in terms of how the venture capital and founder community thought about who should run companies. And we had this big shift to founder-driven companies where the professional operator would then get hired in as a COO versus as a CEO. And I think that was a massive shift, actually, because if you look at founder-led companies, the pros of them is they have, in many cases, enormous longevity, enormous creativity, enormous reinvention throughout. And the cons are, there's some founders who just don't scale well. And sometimes they get locked into place and all sorts of bad things can happen because of that. So that was a huge shift as an example. I think the other big shift is the timelines for companies to go public. Amazon went public after, what was it, 2 years or something in business? And it had a $500 million or so, $800 million valuation. Yahoo went public very rapidly. And I think they went public similarly in that range, $500, $800 million company, something like that. And so the timelines to IPOs used to be much, much shorter. And that explained why we had a 4-year vest. It's because companies took 4 years to get to liquidity often, or maybe 5 years. But it also really shifted the venture landscape pretty dramatically. And so if you look at most of the ways that stock options are structured, vesting is structured, et cetera, it's based on that timeline to liquidity. And now that's been replaced by big tender offers and rounds. And it means that you have this sort of mid to late stage private market, which is really functioning as sort of a smaller public market in terms of providing liquidity and providing a mechanism for a company to continue to capitalize without dipping into public markets. So that's a massive shift, and that has all sorts of implications as well.
And was that kind of kicked off because of the SoftBank stuff, or was SoftBank like a response to something that was already happening kind of in the shadows? Or because it was like a DST was kind of a big entity in the later stage financing stuff probably 12 years ago or so?
Yeah, I think the real shift was a lot of the stuff after the dot-com bubble collapsed, where there was like Sarbanes-Oxley and other things that came into place that made going public more onerous. But at the same time, I think part of it was later stage capital started showing up that was very founder friendly. And at one point, DST really pioneered these late stage financings where they did a blend of primary, so buying stock directly from the company, and secondary, which is buying stock from employees or early investors or founders. And so effectively that's an IPO. And the thing that everybody forgets is that DST's round with Facebook was actually a down round, or at least part of it, because Microsoft had funded Facebook at, I think it was like a $15 billion valuation or something.
Oh, right.
And then with the great financial crisis happening, Facebook needed to raise more money. And DST showed up with like straightforward terms. They didn't take a board seat. They did this blend. And that was at, I think, I think they bought a range of stock between $5 and $10 billion. And nobody ever talks about that now, of course, that Facebook did a down round, and, these things are treated as these terrible events. And then the company's going to die and all this stuff. But in reality, it's just a financing event. But DST really did help pioneer a lot of those things early on.
So that was the 12 years ago, but the recent kind of private market, public kind of the split, maybe, I mean, is SoftBank kind of a new moment that is shaping the startup ecosystem in a way?
I think SoftBank was a moment, to some extent, due to their investments and where they are today. They've been very silent about raising a follow-on vehicle, and I don't know whether that's happening or not, or how it's happening. But when $100 billion shows up in most industries, it's has a pretty big effect. And in the case of SoftBank, to some extent, they had to seek out capital-intensive businesses, which meant if you look at a lot of the portfolio, it was the Ubers and sort of global counterparts, food delivery. WeWork as an obvious example. And it was less, they did do Slack and they did do Garden, so they did some biotech, they did some SaaS, but there's many fewer SaaS companies that they back, for example, versus marketplaces, just in terms of capital intensivity. It did seem to lead to inflation in both valuations, but also inflation in terms of venture funds raising money to try and compete for very large rounds. And then I think the other thing that it impacted was certain companies really got overcapitalized.
Is there a case to be made about not pursuing growth too fast, especially during early stages of startup, when you think that your product is still kind of in early stages and it's maturing, and you don't want to you want to hold out on the growth that you might get, but just like pursue growth slowly over time?
It's a good question. I think that where a lot of people make a mistake is that they have a product that's fundamentally not working, and they try and attach a growth engine to it. And then it doesn't matter how aggressively you're pushing that growth. The thing just doesn't work and nobody cares, So that's one sort of bad growth. A second type of bad growth is, people will have these viral loops that will drop a user onto a product they don't care about, and there'll be enormous churn. So that's another example of bad growth. So I definitely think there's versions of bad growth. The flip of it is the companies that I've seen that have the rawest forms of product market fit tend to be ones where the product, despite being broken, has so many people trying to use it that is just growing. And it's the old saying that the market is pulling the product out of the company. Right. And, Twitter, when I was there, is a great example where there was constantly the fail whales, the site was falling over, it was barely usable because it was always down. But that was because A, it was built badly initially, but B, because, the market need was so strong and people were pulling the product out so aggressively. And you see that also with certain SaaS products, right? It'll be half broken, but people will all be using it, or an open source project, everybody's using it, but you have to kind of work around the edges to make it work. So I think one sign of raw product market fit is if something is growing despite itself. And that's when okay, I really need to build out the basic engine for this thing to keep scaling.
That's actually related, I think, to the interview you had with him in High Growth Handbook, kind of talking about this mindset that people have of growth at all costs, and that being in opposition sometimes to building responsibly as an empathetic entrepreneur, I think he said. So do you have any real life examples of entrepreneurs you think have taken this approach and sort of sacrificed growth, but been really successful at achieving some of these other outcomes?
Yeah, there's definite examples of that. And if you think of the entire field of social entrepreneurship, you could argue that in some sense is part of what some social entrepreneurs are doing, although not all, right? Like Ramin Bank has had an enormous growth and has been very impressive from that perspective. And then there's other examples where people have purposefully said, I want to do something in my local community and that's it. And I'm going to build a great enterprise to help people locally. So I do think that's really important. I do think that sometimes people overinterpret what's good work versus bad work, or good work versus, work that they don't view as good enough in some sense. And a good example of that is, when I started Color Genomics, which is a company initially it was focused on breast and ovarian cancer risk, primarily in women, and then it broadened into other areas. And so, we were helping a lot of people understand their risk of developing some pretty serious cancers and intervene in them. And people would call me and say, oh, isn't it great that you're finally working on something meaningful? And before this, I'd worked at Twitter, which was part of the Arab Spring. I worked at Google, which had provided enormous price transparency and access to information for the world. People forget how hard it was to actually get access to information in the 90s before there was the internet and search engines, or even during, a trivial, stupid example is you want to look up a recipe to cook something for your kid, which I'm like the primary cook in my family. And it was really painful to actually find stuff, right? You'd have to go to the library and check out a cookbook, or you'd have to go and buy a cookbook. Now I can look up any recipe at any time on my phone. And that's a trivial example, right? There's much more important information that you can find now. And so I always found that kind of statement very odd. I thought working on cancer and initially women's health and then broader health was incredibly rewarding and important. But that doesn't mean that those other things weren't important.
This would kind of be applicable to both of you. What are the two of you thinking is like the most, your top goals professionally over the next decade? And what do you think that we should be focusing on? Specifically, not on being a billion-dollar company. I have really zero interest in that, but impacting the world, especially, the world's poor, the people that need us most, that are in a point of privilege.
One of the things that's worried me a little bit over the last couple of years, and I talked about this when my book came out 2 or 3 years ago, is the degree to which cynicism has really become so pervasive around so much of what technology can actually do that can help people. And I think when you take such a cynical and dour attitude, you end up hurting the ability of people who are very optimistic and want to do something very positive. You really hurt their ability to affect change. And so the example I gave at the time was, There was a young founder that I was helping out. I think he was 21 or 22 at the time. And he was at a dinner party and people asked him what he wanted to do. And he said, hey, I want to start a company because I think I can really do great things for other people and I can help them. And, somebody at the dinner party started laughing at him. And they said, oh, you sound like you're something out of Silicon Valley, that TV show, that's so stupid, et cetera, et cetera. And he asked me for advice. He was emotionally wrought. He's like, am I thinking about this the wrong way? And I said, well, you should get better friends. If those are the people you're hanging out with, you should find other people to hang out with who believe in building things for others and doing things that can actually be useful for the world. And so, I do think that fundamentally, to some extent, like attracts like as well. And you'll find these pockets of deeply unhappy, cynical people. And then you'll find pockets of people who are optimistic and want to do good work and want to do things that are important and want to change the world and think technology is a way to do it. And those would be the people I just spend time with and just start asking, what do those folks find interesting? Or what are some ideas I can bounce around with people who are, fundamentally taking an optimistic view on the world? Because if you lose that view, you're never going to accomplish anything great. You're not going to do a moon landing if somebody constantly tells you about how hard the physics are. And obviously there's people who have different threads of these things throughout their lives and they all overlap and interlap. It's just more, where's the primary focus at a different stage of your life? And so I'm personally very much going through the family side of it, the societal side, thinking through some of those things. But honestly, I've always cared a lot about, contributing locally to the community I'm part of, which I view as the tech community, and this really strong ethos of giving back that was here when I showed up. I mean, I remember when I moved out here, I slept on a friend of a friend's couch for the first month or two. And they just let me crash there because I was moving out here to work in the Bay Area. And they're just like, sure, you can just sleep on my couch for a couple months. And then people would just make me help out. And, it was very, very fluid and people just helped each other.
I'm really curious about how do you sort of develop those skills to build really great products to sort of make a difference, in people's lives or the world?
I think being able to build stuff is really powerful. And you see that in terms of some of the people who go and try and contribute in terms of, applying skills that they learn at various tech companies to help with different social aspects. Climate change is actually one where I'm seeing a lot of people coming out of companies like Stripe and other companies really trying to contribute, the different skill sets that they've developed over time. And I think fundamentally the two ways to really build out product specific skills is one, to work on great products. It sounds obvious, but I think fundamentally asking where are there really interesting things being built in a repeated way at scale are probably the places where as somebody coming straight out of school, you're going to learn the most in terms of the actual discipline of being a product manager or building products. And I think that's different from actually just building something. I think side projects and experimentation are all very important as well. But if you want to truly learn the discipline, then there's a handful of companies I think that are really good at it that you can go to and learn from. Or alternatively, if you're a founder, some founders end up hiring people who know areas much better than them and then just learning off of them. Like Bill Gates in the early Microsoft days was notorious for hiring in COOs who he'd then learn from, and then he'd kind of replace them every 24 to 48 months with the next person at the next scale that's relevant to the company. And he'd learn all he could off of those people. So I think you can also, if you're on the founder side of this question, assuming your company starts to work, you can actually hire great people that you can learn from.
For those of you that haven't read the First Round Capital article about Elad's sort of framework, it's an amazing read. So I'm kind of curious if you've seen any really interesting non-obvious markets develop in the last few months, given the world has changed so dramatically. I'm curious to see what they are. And then maybe as an addendum to that question, obviously you have one of the most amazing portfolios of any investors out there, having invested in a lot of companies that have hit really strong product market fit. I've always assumed that was because of your non-obvious market approach to identifying and evaluating these opportunities. But I'm curious to sort of see if that is the actual approach, or if you have some other framework for evaluating these ideas and startups.
Sure. Yeah. So I think fundamentally, a startup idea for something that's really big definitionally has to be non-obvious, because if it was obvious, everybody would be doing it. So to some extent, the best opportunities, or I should say the most obvious opportunity, is going to be picked over. And in many cases, there will be incumbents already working on them. And so almost definitionally, startups have to be things that are either weird or feel small, or for some reason, or there's a new technology breakthrough, so suddenly it's available, or the market seems really crowded, but nobody's actually doing it well. Like there's lots of these sorts of examples where, Dropbox and Box got formed when there was a dozen different, cloud file service providers, and, still, none of them were very good. So there's room to do something interesting. And I remember, Stripe in the early days, people would say, why do you need yet another online payment processor and things like that. The flip of it is it has to be obvious to somebody or they wouldn't be working on it. So obviousness to some extent is in the eye of the beholder. There are areas that I definitely think are interesting right now during COVID or due to COVID. And in general, I think you can think of it almost as like a 2x2 matrix, where you have things that are going to be accelerated by COVID versus things that are going to be hurt in terms of adoption, and then things that are going to sustain in that adoption versus not. So an example would be trip actions. I'm not involved with the company. It seems like a really fantastic one. Since nobody's traveling effectively, I'm sure their business is hurt. But I'm guessing in a couple of years it'll snap back, right? So as long as they can bridge through a couple of years, they'll do great. So that's an example of something that's hurt by COVID, but in a non-sustainable way. Similarly, something like Instacart is obviously seeing dramatically more usage due to COVID. And my guess is even if they don't sustain peak COVID levels, they've still gotten a couple of years of, advancement in a very short period of time in terms of just rapid adoption of their product and service. And so that's sustainable in some sense. Or Zoom would be another example, right? Zoom has suddenly become this major service that people are using for everything. When I look at that, there's certain areas that I think are kind of super interesting. I'm very interested in different types of social products right now. I think there's a generational opportunity in terms of every generation, I think, will turn over in terms of the social products it uses, but also people are kind of stuck at home or they're more hesitant to go and see people in person. And so I think there's a moment in time where you can try a lot of these things. Clubhouse would be an example of something which, I think probably got some initial acceleration due to COVID. There's a bunch of stuff in terms of vertical SaaS and, helping people start working remotely. If you think about it, the penetration of distributed work was quite low, and now suddenly everybody's forced to do it. And so things like Zoom obviously benefit, but there's probably, half a dozen other products to build. That's an example of something that's obvious. And probably the non-obvious thing is what to build there, or what's the permutation that'll work, because people have been trying some of these things for years. I've funded a number of companies that have failed that were focused on remote work 2-3 years ago. They just couldn't get as strong adoption as they can now. So I think it's a big mix, and I think there's all sorts of interesting things to be done right now.
And in terms of that affecting your approach to angel investing, a lot of investors talk about like teams, some investors talk a lot about market, some talk a lot about like the specific product. Do you have any specific focus in your framework when you think about it? Is it primarily market for you, or do you think about it a different way?
Yeah, I'd say the three most important things for me are, number one, market. Or product market, I should say. It's not just, are they in a market? Does a product fit the market, and are they building something interesting relative to it? And to your point, I put that above who the founders are, not because I don't think the founders are singularly important, but more simply because I've seen really great people in terrible markets get crushed by the market. And then the team is obviously crucial. So that's number two. And then number three is, are they ethical people? If they call me at 10 o'clock at night on a Saturday night, would I want to pick up the phone and talk to them or help them? Because life is short, and you don't want to be dealing with a bunch of folks that are bozos, effectively.
Thank you, Elad, for spending the time with us. But I also wanted to thank a bunch of other community members. There's a lot of familiar faces who've shown up. As of right now, we're opening up RSVPs for our next Highlighter Live session. And we're welcoming Nadia Egbal, who just announced her new book, Working in Public, which explores an idea that's actually very relevant to a lot of the topics that Elad is talking about, and sort of new social products and new platforms on the internet. We're going to have her on the show here on Highlighter Live for launch day. We'll have a summary with the discussion links to the YouTube and all of that. So I'm very thankful that everybody showed up and that we had a great discussion here today, and thankful to Elad and thankful to all of the Highlighter Live participants here. So thanks for joining us, and we will see you online.